back to the Craftsman Online podcast. This is New York State's only 5-star rated podcast. Any opinions, thoughts, or viewpoints shared during this program are that of the individual and do not reflect the official position of any Grand Lodge, appendant, or concordant body from which that member may hail. I'm your host, Brother Michael Arce, co-founder of CraftsmanOnline.com, and you've joined us for another episode of Comics in the Craft as we look to examine the connections between the Infinity Stones of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and their connection to Freemasonry. And joining us for this program is Worshipful Brother Wes Latchford. Welcome to the podcast, Brother Wes.
It is an absolute honor to be here.
Worshipful Brother Wes is the past master of Atlantic Lodge Number 2, Norfolk. I know there's some debate on how to say that correctly, right?
There's the polite way and then the correct way.
Gotcha. And he's also the current master of Lynn Haven Lodge Number 220 in Virginia Beach. And on top of all of that, he's the district education officer of the 35th Masonic District of the Grand Lodge of Virginia and a huge comic book guy, which is why he is here to join us. I recently got a chance to see his presentation on the Infinity Stones at the summer barbecue meeting from Manassas Lodge, just up the road from me here in Manassas, Virginia. Before we get started on the Infinity Stones, I want to get a little bit into your comic book collection, you as a comic fan. What got you into comic books? Who was your first character?
It really started actually in elementary school, and it's just one of those weird things, and not to belay age, but in the early to mid 70s, a couple of our teachers in our elementary school, and I grew up in the central Pennsylvania Appalachian Mountains, a very rural area. And so the teachers were just happy we were reading anything. And so read comic books. Right. One, it's actual reading. The other thing that once a few of them got smart, realized there can be a whole lot of storylines all going on at once in comics at the time. So that's kind of where I got started, just reading comics, but collecting didn't really start in earnest until junior and senior high school. My collection probably got to about 750 issues total. At one point, had two other best friends in high school who were also readers and collectors, and one of them literally had thousands upon thousands of titles and everything else. So that's where it started. Junior, senior high school. I was pretty much all about Spider-Man at the time. And yes, for those who need to know, Spider-Man is hyphenated. Don't misspell it. You'll make Stan Lee roll over in his grave. What ended up happening was we were collecting probably 10 to 20 titles a month.
Wow. Okay.
And what you would do is you would buy one to read, and then one that you would carefully put in a little plastic wrapper and seal it up and stick it very neatly, so it wouldn't crumple or do anything else. And eventually grew up and stopped. But then it was exciting to see Marvel come back into its own. There was a point where they had to sell off a lot of their titles and a lot of their characters in order to just stay in business. But they're now starting to bring them all back under, not just the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but the comics as well. And so it's been interesting to watch that, having kind of grown up with those characters and seeing a lot of them all of a sudden reappear again.
Just this part, we will get to the Infinity Stones, I promise our listener. But one of the things that is interesting, just hearing you talk about comic books, is that, we grew up in a generation where we were collectors. So you were into comic books. I was into baseball cards. And I think of young people now, like when I look at my son, who's 15 years old, and how he treats his things. The reason why he would not understand the concept of you had one thing that you got to handle and the other that you had to store, that you took care of, that stayed in pristine shape, because if anything happened to it, the value of that card, that comic, would just be gone. The other thing that's interesting too is, imagine at that age in junior high school and high school, going back to talk to young Wes and saying, well, here's why some of the fractured storylines exist with some of my favorite superheroes, is because, well, the company that owns this doesn't own this person anymore. And, we had to understand why the business that now has become Marvel and DC when it comes to what I think most Americans see is in the movies. The other thing, to your point, the teachers encouraging kids to read, I didn't really understand how intertwined the comics are to Greek mythology until I went and saw the latest Thor movie, and I'm like, what is Zeus and a lightning bolt doing in a Thor movie? And then watched the Eternals on Disney Plus and was like, wow, there is a lot of actual history that's being weaved into these stories that continues to be told, which I think is part of what is appealing to us in Masonry, is that we see some of these old ancient teachings still becoming relevant to us in modern times. One thing you did mention in your presentation was you had your most prized possession comic collection that you sold to do something very important in your life with. So what was that comic, and what was the reason for selling it?
There were two separate ones that, again, at the time, you don't have any idea. You don't know when you purchase a baseball card.
Mm-hmm.
You get somebody's rookie card, and you have no idea if he's going to be, a Hall of Famer later on, or, for me, I had at one time a Roberto Clemente card.
Wow.
Not knowing that, they would pass away. I grew up on the Pittsburgh side of the mountains, so you don't know when you first start purchasing whether or not it's ever going to be anything, particularly if you're not buying to read, but just to collect. So I ended up, just through happenstance, with two different series or set of issues that eventually, over time, became pretty good investments. The first one was a series in Daredevil, where it's come to be known as the Elektra series, where Elektra got introduced. She first appeared in Daredevil 168, which, again, it wasn't far into his titles. And interestingly enough, she was a highly trained female assassin who was supposed to go kill Matt Murdock, aka Daredevil, and then all of a sudden became his love interest, and it was this on and off. But she was only supposed to appear in one issue, and she ended up appearing in a series of 13 issues, and eventually she ends up getting killed, and Daredevil goes off the deep end, blah 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 blah. But the thing that was interesting of it, you didn't know at the time that series of 13 issues was going to be incredibly important and become a very, very good collector's piece. So I had that, the Elektra series, but the ones that, again, just through pure coincidence, I actually have had Amazing Spider-Man 121 and 122. And that 121 is the death of Gwen Stacy.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Which was big on two different levels. One, it was a big turning point in Peter Parker's life. The other thing was, at that time, it was unheard of to kill off somebody in a superhero's tribe, right? Their posse, their little private group of friends. And the fact that not only did she die, but it may very well have been his fault, was pretty revolutionary. So those two particular series were worth a lot of money, and so for whatever reason, I felt so inclined to sell them in order to have cash to buy my wife's engagement ring.
Good investment.
And it's one of her favorite stories. Although I do have to thank my mom for not throwing the comics out at one point after I had moved out of the house.
Yeah.
So, we've all had that too.
Oh, that's the worst phone call to get. Yeah, you moved off to college, son. Yeah. Your mom and I were going through your room. We found some boxes, like shoe boxes that had your old cards in them. We just threw them away. Oh my God, no, you didn't. What? No. The other thing that's interesting too, and we're going to spare our listener, because I figure if you're into it this deep, we don't need to get into the backstory on the Affinity Stones. You were here to get into this, and we love you and we appreciate you for that. I found it so compelling during your presentation that you tackled one of the more interesting, because to the general American that was going in and watching these movies, we had no idea that Marvel had set up the whole cinematic universe with, this is how we're going to connect all of these stories with these stones that most of us just knew about Captain America, Iron Man, the Spider-Man. We knew about the Central. We had no idea who these other people are. When did you start as a Freemason making some of these connections with our ritual or some of the deeper meanings of the Masonic lessons to what goes on with the Infinity War saga or storyline?
I had started taking a look at different Eastern traditions, and not only just what we would traditionally think Hinduism, Buddhism, and various other religious aspects, but I also started looking at Eastern medicine
Mm.
and philosophies. And so one of the things that was of interest to me was the whole idea of chakras and our chakra energy. And chakra, is a Sanskrit word that basically means disc or wheel, and it's describes the energy centers in your body. And so I started, studying that. Actually went so far as to take a class and a course in it. So now I'm a chakra healer. If your, chakras are out of line, let me know. But the other thing I found with it is within each one of the seven chakras, there are descriptions of what it channels, and if it's blocked, what you're handicapped at being able to utilize. But they're also have colors associated with them.
Mm-hmm.
And so as I was looking and at the chakras at, at whatever point, probably mowing the yard, because this is when I do my best thinking, because there's nothing but the roar of the mower engine, is that, oh, holy cow, the colors of the chakras are the exact same colors as the infinity stones.
Mm.
I wonder if there's something there. So then I started looking to see if there happened to be what we would consider real world equivalents for the infinity stones here on earth, based on color, but then also based on whatever the makeup and description was. And what I found was somebody had actually done that out of Mumbai.
Hmm.
And so they had actually taken a look and matched each one of the infinity stones to one of either a traditional jewel stone or a an actual healing crystal. And so it's the soul stone, with amber and coral. Um, but it goes through a list of all the different things that it does. It represents diplomacy and concurrence, and intuition and imagination. And then the reality stone can be a ruby, again, which is the energy of the body and works positive energy and spiritual vitality. The space stone um, really is a sapphire, and the sapphire, is one that gives you ancient knowledge and wisdom. The power stone, that is a gem that could be amethyst, time stone, which is the green one, obviously an emerald. And then the mind stone, with its yellow hues, basically topaz. And each one of those particular stones, if you're married or have a significant other and you've done the whole anniversary thing, because every year has an associated stone with it, although wives seem to think every anniversary is diamonds. um,
Right.
they have certain properties that are associated with them. And so as I started to discover that, those descriptions of those intrinsic things associated with those gemstones and the mind stones also read very, very similarly to what we learn and talk about in Freemasonry. And, so Alice was in the rabbit hole, and, this is what she found.
I'm just imagining you mowing the yard and trying to get around the sprinkler because you have this idea and you're like, I gotta write this down. I need to tell somebody this. So I had two questions on that. If we could back up a little bit, is one, who was the first person when you made this discovery, when you made this connection? Who's the first person that you told, and what was their reaction?
Yeah, so there's a couple brothers around here, and we all.
Okay, good. It was a brother.
Yeah, 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 and we all happen to belong to the Virginia Research Lodge.
Oh my gosh, so you got a great support group. Okay, for me, it's I go tell my wife something, and she looks at me and goes,
Yeah, and you get the look. It's like, yeah, and the refrigerator still doesn't work. So, um, but yeah, so there's a couple brothers who kind of think the same way I do, and we come up with these thoughts, and so we bounce them off of each other. And I can distinctly remember the one I called and talked with Joel, and he was just like, oh, holy cow, and we probably talked for half an hour. As conversations go, we probably spent 5 minutes on that and then went off on a whole bunch of other tangents.
Oh man, yeah. And it makes, like I said, it makes for a great lodge presentation because you're sitting there and you're like, I remember watching all these movies and now I'm going to start rewatching them or revisiting them to can make these same connections. Can I do what Brother Latchford did? The other thing that I wanted to ask you about, and this is what always fascinates me about Freemasonry, is that for the most part, the ritual is pretty much the same with maybe some differences from jurisdiction to jurisdictions. I have studied the standard work and lecture for the Grand Lodge of New York and am learning the ritual here for DC. Nowhere in either one of those books do they mention the word chakra. How did you make a Masonic connection to that?
Yeah, and it is a little difficult to picture, Benjamin Franklin or worshipful Brother Washington, sitting with their legs crossed and cleansing their chakras. It really was reading through and seeing the similarities in words
Mm,
and in descriptions of crown chakra and the third eye chakra, which is intuition. And as you go through, you're hearing the same kinds of things that you hear when someone talks about, and we just initiated an EA last evening. So, when the master stands there and presents him the working tools and talks about the 24-inch gauge and what it represents, and then you think about, the particular chakra that
hmm
helps your mind to gather around reality and time. And it's like, okay. And then you start thinking about the time stone, where it's like, yeah, we only have 24 hours in a day, can't make any more, can't make any less. And what you do during that time is incredibly important.
Right.
It all just starts to come together. And part of what it does, and part of what you start to realize the more you explore what Freemasonry has to offer to you, is that these really are moral truths, and they're not unique necessarily to Freemasonry. I mean, they're, as much as a secular society today will try to tell you the truth is whatever you want to think it is. No, there are some truths that are inherent across cultures, across religions, across continents, across eons, that have been handed down, and all of these different things capture that. And again, as you stop looking at them individually and start to overlay them, you really do start to see where little bolts of light, for lack of a better description, start pounding through every single one of them, and then they'll smack you right in the middle of the forehead while you're mowing the lawn, and you'll go, wow, I just got a presentation.
Here's what I love about this is that for brothers that are listening and maybe they've heard the chakra connection before, and this is what I find fascinating, because they'll say I've studied the ritual, this is not me. But the symbology, the deeper meaning of these words, when we talk about veiled and allegory, like it is literally written there in plain sight, to the point of, if you know, you recognize what this means. And now you get to be in this culture, this group of other like-minded men who also understand this. There are, I would say, in Freemasonry, smaller groups. That's why I found that you're in a great position where you have a research group and you have this group of guys who can huddle around. Others of us, we might be the only person in our lodge that has some of these ideas, and we have to go seeking for someone to share the knowledge. But I think technology is bringing it all together, so it's healthy to have this, and I'm excited that we're having this conversation, because I'm hoping that there's other brothers, and I know they are in the craft, that if you've had these thoughts, pursue them, see where they go, and then most importantly, come back to your lodge and share your findings with the rest of us. And that's what I found interesting about your presentation, where if you get a chance to see Brother Latchford's talk on the Infinity Stones, I would say bring 2 cups, because the first cup is going to get full on the knowledge, and then the second part is you're going to really start making these connections. You do talk about the chakras, you do talk about the powers that connect with the stones if we found them here on Earth, besides looking pretty on the jewelry counter for wives as as they look at it. You also get into talking about the working tools. And I wanted to kind of get into some of that connection with the Infinity Stones too. For the casual Marvel fan, we didn't really know who this Thanos guy was until the end of the Avengers movie when you see a sneak peek of him sitting in the chair. And then most of us had to Google it or ask our comic book friend, what is going on here? And then they describe like what is going to happen. And you're like, wait a second, these stones. So we can use our working tools for good, and sometimes we can overuse them. Let's get into the good connections, the positive connections between the Infinity Stones and our working tools.
Yeah, so let me pick a couple of the ones that really kind of can really jump out without you having to connect too many dots in order to make this work. So I mentioned um, the 24-inch gauge,
Mm-hmm.
and its importance. And to me, and again, these are just my visualizations and interpretations of it. So for the 24-inch gauge, you would immediately say, well, okay, time stone, right? 24-inch gauge, 24 hours in the day, time. But the other thing that time does that I don't think we necessarily emphasize enough in the EA degree and the Master Mason's degree, we hit on it pretty well, but we don't talk about time as a commodity
Mm,
and having that also connect to our mortality and our shared time. Not only do we have our own individual time, but we have these interactions and we have this time that we spend with other people, and we choose to spend it, with brothers of the fraternity. But there's that infinite number of years, days, hours, and minutes, and the Grand Architect doesn't tell us how much time is left.
yep.
And that was one thing when I reflected on that back to where Doctor Strange, again, come with me, where Doctor Strange is in Infinity War and is literally abusing the time stone and going ahead and seeing literally millions of instances where they don't win, and it comes back and says, but there's one where we do.
Right.
And but that thing is he's looking for that, how much time do they have left, and how can they get more. And so it's each up to each one of us to decide what we're going to do with that time, because tomorrow's not promised in any way, shape, or form. And I think we lose that. So, but for me, that was like 24-inch gauge is very definitely time. But one of the things as I was looking at that I really kind of liked reading through and exploring was the reality stone,
Hmm.
which is also the ether. So if you watch the movies, it's the ether that Jane Foster gets stuck in her in Thor. But my tie to the ether and the reality stone was just our existence to reality, and kind of thought that it could be represented by the 7 liberal arts and sciences. It's part of the fellowcraft degree, but what it does is the liberal arts and sciences are our idealization of reality that has education and intellectual and cultural discipline, so that you have the tools in order to continue to pursue perfection, and form reality in the way it's supposed to be, and understand reality as it's happening to you, which is almost as important, if not more so. Because again, everyone can pick somebody who just has their head in the clouds or refuses to accept the reality of a situation. And so by being well versed in the 7 liberal arts and sciences, we're better able to deal with that and to understand and work our realities. And again, we're supposed to be embracing and learning that as Masons, but unfortunately, I think a lot of times it just ends up being part of the middle chamber lecture, and we move on. But when you can make these ties to the everyday thing, it brings it back to you outside of the lodge, which is pretty exciting too. I have a presentation where I talk about, it's very easy to look at and understand and think about the tools and symbols of Freemasonry when you're sitting in lodge, because you're surrounded by it. You can't look in any particular direction in a lodge room where you don't see something. once you leave the lodge room, now it's incumbent upon you to find those connections, which is where you're like, oh, holy cow. Well, what about chakras? And like, oh, holy smoke, chakras could be, and, Reiki could be, infinity stones. And wow, infinity stones might represent this. And hey, that working tool's telling me the same thing that this is. And to me, that's what makes, Freemasonry exciting and life changing.
Yeah, I would much rather spend a Friday night, even if it's just overhearing, not maybe as an active participant, but in the circle, hearing a brother talk about this, than just being at home watching Thor for the 400th time or the Avengers movie, because this is the engaging part of it. And this is the part where when brothers or interested gentlemen are trying to find the value in Freemasonry, it's hard to tell them, but then there's this club, this group that you get to be a part of. When we say like-minded, it's like, oh, well, because they all believe in a supreme being. Well, yes, and they all believe, yeah, we have to have these common things, but we also have these other cool things that we can kind of nerd and geek out on that we can share openly with each other and be like, oh, cool, that I've never thought of that before. So we've talked about the positive aspect of the Infinity Stones, which is interesting in the storyline, is that we have our central protagonist, Thanos, who's trying to gather these things up because he is not going to use these for good, at least for half of the population, for their sake. In the movie, in his mind, he thinks it's the right thing to do. And I started thinking about Thanos as maybe a representation of the ruffians. Have you ever made that connection in the Heramic legend with this central character that is trying to go about getting something that hasn't really earned the right to have the power to do that yet?
Admittedly, no, I hadn't thought of it until you mentioned it. But Thanos believes he's doing this for all the right reasons, right? And part of it was his reality, because his home planet of Titan was, gee, go figure this. The population was getting too large for the planet to sustain, and so he had the audacious idea that they just randomly select half the population and dispose of them and get back to something that's sustainable. And of course, he was then banned from the planet because they're like, well, not only no, but hell no. But he believes it's the right thing to do, and it goes even beyond just his planet, but he starts to see it, galactically, where all of these things are issues, at which point then he starts that pursuit of the Infinity Stones, because he knows if he can get all of them, he doesn't have to go planet by planet, in order to equalize, create equilibrium for their sustainment. He can do it with just the snap of a finger. And so thus, we get the pursuit of the stones. But it does lead that question of, and maybe he isn't really worthy of them. Again, in his reality, his mindset, he's doing it for all the right reasons, doing the wrong thing for the right reasons, right? Like we've heard that before. And for the ruffians, it really is kind of the same things. They will sit and, when they get to the first ruffian, I mean, he flat out says why he wants what he wants. So I can do this and this and this, and look, and he is refused. And so they go to the second and refused, and the third. So so it is that question of, they were seeking possession of something that they aren't entitled to have, or at least not entitled to have at that particular point in time. But to them, it was all the right reasons.
Yeah, they thought their motivations were pure, just like Thanos. That was the interesting thing. Again, not being the most in-depth comic guy, just doing the research and finding out, like, Thanos had a plan. Just like the ruffians. The ruffians, there's a reason why they go after Grandmaster Hiram Abiff, just like why Thanos basically kind of hid in the shadows until certain other figures in the Marvel Cinematic Universe weren't around to threaten him anymore, so that he could he was a lurker. He came out and saw his opportunity, just like the ruffians did. Why did they grab Hiram at that time and at that place? Because they had a plan. It was a bad plan, but they had thought it through. And I think being able to make those connections with comics and the craft is what makes Freemasonry unique. And it was another comment that we had shared after your presentation, which is that in everywhere in your life where you can find joy, you can find Freemasonry. And some of the images that you've shared with me of just pictures of everyday things that you're like, see, there's a Masonic connection here, here, and here. And for me, again, getting back to this is what brings me to the lodge, is to have these conversations with brothers who go out in the world that we all live in, and they're seeing things at a different angle, and they're being able to share that.
And the other thing with that too, and this is something we always need to be very aware of and attuned to, is creating and having that environment where you feel willing to share and to have those conversations and not get shut down. There can be instances, particularly when it's something like this, which can be a very, very select topic and a select group of folks, where others will just kind of pile on and shut it down. And that's unfortunate. Part of what we do, is to not only know what we know, but then also be willing to learn more and to not only impart knowledge, but also receive knowledge. And we do miss that a bit. One of the other things that, as we were sitting here talking, that I just thought of as well is, we, in the conversations of the ruffians, we always talk about 3 ruffians and fellow crafts, but there was a very, very good chance that there could have been 15 ruffians.
Mm.
If they'd have followed through with the audacity of the crime, and done what they all had intended to do. So they had a plan, and when it got down to it, with the 3 of them, it was 12% of a plan, to quote Peter Quill. So
very true.
But and one of the other things too, thinking about it, with the ruffians, and one of the thoughts was that I just had was, if Hiram had not refused to divulge what he knew, and had given them what they sought, what kind of power and influence might they have ended up having?
Right.
And how might that have influenced the rest of the craft? Right. You have those pivotal events where everything changes after that. You say, 9/11.
It would have been our snap.
Yeah. Yeah, we start talking about, I've heard people talk about BC now, before COVID, and changes and things. So that whole idea of ruffians and Thanos and Infinity Stones got me thinking, well, what if they had actually succeeded? What if they had gotten the stones and were, able to snap their fingers because they had, the word? Who knows?
Yeah.
But yeah.
Tony Stark would have gotten to make an appearance.
Yeah. I don't think we can pay Robert Downey nearly as much as he'd want now.
And there'd be fewer complaints for guys to go see the Master Mason degree.
Well, you know what? Yeah, that is true. Maybe we get Industrial Light and Magic to work on some of the slides for the lectures.
Very true. Well, Brother Wes, I am so excited. Thank you so much for coming on this podcast. I have an idea. I want to get you back on for another edition of Comics in the Craft to talk about probably one of the worst Spider-Man movies that I've ever seen. Get your ideas on that, but also maybe how it could also talk a little bit about Masonic forgiveness and some of the other values that we have. But that should be for another episode. But thanks again for being a part of this podcast.
Oh, yeah, no worries. And thank you again for hanging out and being a geek.
If you've enjoyed this episode and you want to hear more, you can just say, "Hey Siri," or "Hey Alexa," to play the latest version of our Craftsman Online podcast. We're available on every streaming platform with new episodes every Monday morning. Until next time, let peace and harmony prevail.